Welcome to day 2 of our Blended Learning Conference. I want to get started with effective implementation of personalized learning. What do we mean by personalized learning? You'll remember the core 4 components of personalized learning laid out by Education Elements. And those are targeted instruction, data-driven decision-making, flexible content and tools, and student reflection and ownership. We're going to look at each of those today, and the protocol we'll go through is to look at where we are on that continuum in each area, and then look at tactics that will help us to improve, and eventually at the end of it we'll look at a potential sample of how you might get started in, let's say, the first 20 days of school. So we're going to begin by looking at targeted instruction. What do we mean by targeted instruction? It's been broken down here into 3 areas. We've got groupings, data, and instruction. When we talk about groupings, we mean flexible and dynamic groupings based on data. Okay, the more static those groupings are, the less sustaining we are of this type of innovation and targeted instruction and grouping. We're looking for data to come in on a frequent basis, and that be part of daily instruction. That's the goal here. Okay? And lastly, we're looking for one-on-one instruction to be delivered and these small group instruction to be delivered for multiple purposes, not just simply for remediation, but also for extension, for introduction, for practice, for many different scenarios. So what I want you to do is take a look at this continuum, find out where you're at. You'll pause the video here, and you'll note what next steps might look like. Go ahead and do that. Okay, you're back. We're talking now about tactics that might help us to improve our targeted instruction. So throughout this time, these resources are all here for you, by the way, below the video. So you can go and see these as you'd like. I'm going to open up the Core 4 Tactics Bank here and look at targeted instruction. I'm just going to note a couple of these that stand out to me before we move on. So some of these that I find stand out to me, the idea of flexible grouping in dynamic ways. And so that piece here under flexible grouping, there's some examples here that you can click on and take a look at. Small group instruction. What I think would be helpful is reserving time each day for that kind of small group instruction. So it gives some tips on what that looks like and some examples here that I would consider exploring. And lastly, in one-on-one instruction or small group instruction, I like the idea of offering one-on-one conferencing. All of these ideas are great. I'd invite you to explore the ones that stand out to you. I just wanted to pinpoint a couple that stood out to me when I'm talking about teacher-led conferences and some of these other tools in targeted instruction. So take a few minutes and explore these pieces here and pause the video. Okay, we're going to return now and go to the next part of our continuum when it comes to data-driven decision-making. When we look at data-driven decision-making, 3 components here. Data sources. Are there a variety of data sources that we're looking at, or just simply one all the time? Are we consistently using that data from multiple sources to drive and inform instructional decisions? That's what we mean. Does data inform our practice? So really, how much impact does that have? The form of assessment that we're gathering, do we receive immediate feedback, or is it rather delayed? Okay, the just-in-time, timely supports that we want to offer through formative assessment data, that's what we're looking for here. And then lastly, do we share that data? And how do students access that data? And as teachers, how do we target individual student needs with that data? And so that's really the idea of this data culture piece and data teams, including likely your PLC team. So what I want you to do now is, again, pause the video here, look at this, and decide where you're at when it comes to these 3 areas of data-driven decision-making. Go ahead and do that now. As we look to the tactics bank, I'm going to click on the data-driven decisions. It's going to take me to that. Couple of practices and tactics that I think stood out to me. The idea of a data portfolio. For me, a great example of that is what we see in Mastery Connect, but you may choose to use others. And so this allows students to easily be able to access their data, review it, as well as teachers to be able to access and sort the data. Assessment. I like the idea of exit tickets. Providing those exit tickets on a frequent basis so that you can group and regroup students based on who understood the topics that you've covered that day for the next day to kind of get you started. And then student interests. Surveying students or allowing them to take some sort of a student interest survey is a great idea for getting to understand your students' interests, but also their learning preferences. And so I would consider doing that as you make data-driven decisions. There's lots of great ideas here. I'd give you just some time to explore that. Go ahead and do that now and pause the video. Okay, heading into flexible content and tools. So we've got some main ideas around flexibility, path being one, okay, offering content and learning paths that allow for students to take on things that they're not only interested in, but things that meet their needs, right? And so things that best meet their learning modalities, their preferences, and the needs that they have. That's what we mean by differentiating the learning path. And pacing, of course, is pretty self-explanatory. Do we allow students to self-direct their pace in learning through the content, or is that set for them? And then lastly, performance tasks. This is in the demonstration of evidence. How many choices are we giving? Are we offering flexible tools to allow them to provide evidence in different ways or demonstrate their learning in different ways? And how do you establish protocols and routines for that? So that's the idea of performance tasks. I want you to take a look here, evaluate yourself and where you're at, give it a pause, and identify next steps before we move to the core tactics bank. Okay, now we're moving to the core tactics bank for flexible content tools. Lots of great pieces here, a ton. So one of the things I'd like to point out under this area is the learning menus, allowing students to choose, like on a menu, from the different components that they need for different activities or different options for demonstrating their learning. Okay. Additionally, adaptive content, making that a part of your plan so that maybe that's through mastery pathways, maybe that's through other differentiation, that things are adapted based on their required needs to learn and understand the content. There's some great examples here, and I like that these are grade specific here. I would check those out. Individualized playlists are an interesting idea in this next piece, highly customizable content. Students can work through a playlist of materials that's personalized to them. That requires you to either have that set up for them or to have like 3 or 4 options, like a menu of a couple of different playlists that they could go through. I like this idea. I think it would take a little bit of work to set up, but of course it would allow students to really feel like their learning is customized. And then real-world performance. I love the idea of partnerships here to connect to real-world performance, and using the design thinking process is another thing I would suggest as you are connecting students to real-world problems. Yeah, another resource for that might be the global goals. If you look at the UN's global goals for sustainable development, that might provide a resource for students to dive in to real-world work. So there are some pieces there under flexible content and tools. I hope you just take a minute just to reflect on those and see which ones you enjoy before we move on to the last portion. So go ahead and pause the video and do that now. Okay, lastly, we've got student reflection and ownership. 3 main areas here: goal setting, reflection, and ownership. Reflecting on your own data, I think, kind of comes first. So I'm going to reverse the order a little bit here. But allowing students to reflect on their own data that's available maybe in their Mastery Connect tracker or other trackers, right? To be able to review that then sets the stage for goal setting, right? So they've been able to review, teachers monitor the reflection. Maybe that's some other reflection tactics that we'll take a look at. Then students are able to set their goals and do that in ways that are smart and meaningful. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. And then ownership. Do you allow for choice in the manners of how students access content, what process they go through to learn, and what products they provide? And to what extent do you offer that choice? So look on this continuum and identify next steps, and then we'll look at the tactics to help you move to the next level. Go ahead and pause the video and do that now. Okay, our last stop on the tactics bank under student reflection and ownership. Reflection. Personally, I think one of the reflection formats that I enjoy here is student behavior tracking. And so tracking students' behavior through maybe an app. I enjoy Live School, others use Class Dojo, other things, to help them reflect on how on task they have been, what steps they need to make in order to really achieve the outcomes they want to achieve. I also like the idea of student focus groups here. What a great idea to bring in your students, say what's working, what's not. Just even a close-knit group that you can reflect with frequently. That would be ideal, wouldn't it? As you're designing for learners should have a voice in that. Goal setting. I'm very familiar with SMART goals, so that one stood out to me first in how students set specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-based goals for their achievement of the standards that you've set forward. And then lastly, allowing for peer evaluation and feedback. So allowing opportunities for peers to give feedback on students' work and say, look, I know this is where you're at right now. This might be next steps for you. This is what I see as you. And that, if the clarity of expectations is there for students to be able to do that, you know you've met your expectations. And finally, I almost missed out on student choice. Of course, a big deal. We've talked about learning menus already. That one I really like. I also like the idea of providing flexible seating if you can. That's not always in your control as a teacher. Or providing 20% time, or that genius hour time, where students can dedicate part of their time to something that they're passionate about, or at least some sort of real application or connection in their learning. So these are some wonderful tools and tactics. The next, what I would encourage you to do is pause the video right now before we move on to really what this might look like over your first 20 days in the classroom. Go ahead and do that now. All right, the first 20 days of personalized learning. I love this document because it really lays out a format for you. We're not going to take a lot of time to go into that, but I just want to give you an overview and point out some things. What I would suggest is you may not use one of these on each day as it's dictated by this kind of calendar for implementation, but you might say, look at the first week and pick a couple things that will help you move towards personalization in your first week of school. Maybe it's identifying student interests or their academic preferences, or maybe it's working individually with students in small group instruction, offering team building. Anyway, all of these I think are excellent ideas to get started that first week. Okay, even offers a station rotation model that might work for you. The second week, getting more into the formative data and allowing for goal setting. It's a great time to do that at the beginning of the year after you've collected some formative data. So I want you to take a look at that. And third, start to really lay out some options for student choice, lay out some peer evaluation strategies, and allow for self-assessment as part of the reflection. I think that takes us to the next level. Okay, it gives an example here of a personalized playlist of what you must do and what you may do. I think that might be something that might intrigue you. And then lastly, providing more one-on-one instruction and data tracking in that last week to really drive your instruction. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I want you to call me over as you need help in implementing personalized learning and getting started.